Russian troops escalated the offensive in the western part of Ukraine. Russian airstrike hit a Ukrainian military base that killed at least 35 people and left over 134 injured close to the Polish border. The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, has issued a grim warning to the NATO members after this attack. He once again called on the Western alliance to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine, adding that failure to do so may lead to Russian missiles falling on NATO territory and NATO citizens.
І зараз я повторюю знову, якщо ви не закриєте наше небо, то це лише питання часу, коли російські ракети впадуть вже на вашу територію, на територію НАТО, на домівки громадян країн НАТО. Сьогодні у Київській області був убитий американський журналіст Брент Ренов. Його колега поранений. Це був свідомий напад російських військових. Вони знали, що вони роблять, але, схоже, не всі на Заході знають, що вони роблять.
Western allies have strongly condemned the Russian attack. Britain called it a significant escalation by the Kremlin. The U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken tweeted, and I'm quoting, "We condemn the Russian Federation's missile attack on the International Center for Peacekeeping and Security in Yavoriv, close to Ukraine's border with Poland. The brutality must stop." The Russian Defense Ministry has said that its forces had used high-precision, long-range weapons in its strike to destroy Ukrainian arms cache and kill up to 180 foreign mercenaries. And with us is our correspondent Rosie Bichard from Brussels for more on these developments. Rosie, any reaction as of now coming in from the NATO on this latest warning from the Ukrainian president?
Well, we don't have anything official from the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, but it's sure to say, Molly, that this is something which will be seen by NATO allies as escalatory. And the reason for that is the sheer proximity to Poland. We know this attack happened roughly 15 miles or 25 kilometers from that Polish border, and that's not only the border by which the majority of refugees have been leaving Ukraine, it's also the border at which NATO territory begins, and that is where that collective defence pledge known as Article 5 begins. That pledge says an attack on one is an attack on all. Now, this plea from Volodymyr Zelenskyy, the Ukrainian president, to essentially close the skies over Ukraine or to initiate a no-fly zone has so far fallen on deaf ears in NATO. NATO says that is a no-go, and the reason is that going into Ukraine with any boots on the ground or any planes in the sky, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says would lead to an even bigger war with much greater human suffering, where we see NATO allies and Russia facing each other down. And with the proximity of this latest attack, that seems more likely than ever. Of course, however, that's something that NATO will avoid wherever possible. We've heard many times a commitment from NATO Secretary General that NATO will defend every inch of its territory.
Right. Rosie, since you mentioned that, Russia already seems to be preparing for an escalation. Moscow has said that it could target Western arms supplies in Ukraine.
Absolutely. That's something we heard from Moscow just over the last few days. And of course, NATO has in the past provided Ukraine with weapons, though NATO, of course, will not be, as they have reiterated many times, sending any troops into Ukraine. Now, NATO defence ministers are due to meet in Brussels this coming week. They're due here on Wednesday in person. We expect all 30 NATO allies represented. So Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin from the United States, for example, should be here, and they will be discussing how to best support Ukraine. But Molly, above all, they'll be discussing how best to protect each other. That collective defence pledge says that, as I said, an attack on one is an attack on all, and therefore they're likely to be looking into how to reinforce further the alliance's eastern flank, including Poland.
Right. Rosie, let's talk further about the no-fly zone over Ukraine, a demand that has been consistently raised by the president of Ukraine. Help us understand what exactly NATO's stance at this point is. Do we expect any discussions, deliberations on that front, or is this the final decision of the alliance?
Well, Molly, I think we can expect some discussions insofar as many NATO allies, the leaders of those countries, are in regular talks with President Zelenskyy. That's something, for example, that French President Macron and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz were able to do over the weekend. They spoke by phone with President Zelenskyy, and we can imagine that the Ukrainian president is reiterating and raising this demand over and over. However, it's been said very clearly several times by both the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and representatives of NATO allies that they see a no-fly zone as a no-go. They think that would lead to a much bigger conflict. So as far as we can see, it's certainly been presented, Molly, as a final decision. But of course, that's something Ukraine will keep pushing for. We even hear campaigners on the ground in Ukraine saying that when NATO says this no-fly zone is not going to happen, that Russia sees this as a green light to continue and intensify attacks. So that's something so far from NATO that, as I said, has been considered not something that can be advanced with because it would be something that would escalate to a greater war. That's something, however, that we do expect will be at least on the defence ministers' minds, if not really on their official agenda when they meet in Brussels later this week.
And we will be coming back to you for further updates on that front. Rosie, thanks very much for now. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.